Goal 7, Lesson 4, Rectangle, Rhombus, and Square. Today we're going to be learning to identify the properties of various quadrilaterals, specifically rectangle, rhombus, and square. And then using those relationships, you're going to find missing parts and answer some different questions about it. The first shape is a rectangle. A rectangle is a parallelogram with 4 right angles. A rectangle has 5 properties. The first property, opposite sides are congruent. Opposite sides are parallel. It has 4 90-degree angles. Diagonals bisect each other. And the diagonals are congruent. If you notice, all of these properties are the same as a parallelogram, so if you remember those, and then there's just 2 additional ones. Number 3, that there's 4 90-degree angles, and number 5, that your diagonals are congruent. Go ahead and stop the video and try the first 3 examples. In example 1, you have the small pieces of a diagonal. If you look at your 5 properties, we know diagonals are congruent, and we know diagonals bisect each other, which means all 4 of your small pieces are congruent or equal. An equation you could write to solve for x is 4x equals 16. And if you divide both sides by 4, your answer is x is 4. Example B. They give you one of your angles is 2x. If you look at your list of properties, you know that every angle is 90 degrees, so that angle would be 90 degrees. You can set 2x equal to 90, divide both sides by 2, and your answer is x is 45. In the final example, they told you how big BD, the entire diagonal, is, and AC, the other entire diagonal. We know that diagonals are congruent, so we can set these 2 pieces equal. 3x plus 1 equals 5x minus 3. There's a few different ways to solve, but what we're going to do is subtract 3x from each side to get our variables on one side, leaving you with 1 equals 2x minus 3. Add 3 to each side to get your constants to one side. 4 equals 2x. And then divide both sides by 2 to get 2 equals x. Our second shape is a rhombus. A rhombus is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides. A rhombus has 7 special properties. The first property, opposite sides parallel. The second property, all sides congruent. The third property, consecutive angles supplementary. The fourth property, opposite angles congruent. The fifth property, diagonals bisect each other. Sixth, diagonals bisect angles. And 7, the diagonals are perpendicular. Again, this has all of the properties of a parallelogram. The extra ones would be 2, knowing all sides, not just opposite. 6, knowing that the diagonals bisect the angles, and 7, knowing the diagonals are perpendicular. So if you remember your parallelogram properties, you only have 3 extras. Again, pause the video and try the 3 examples before watching them. In example A, they give you that one of your angles where the diagonals meet is 9x. Our property says that diagonals are perpendicular, which means they form 90-degree angles. So we can set 9x equal to 90, divide both sides by 9, and our answer is x equals 10. In B, we know that opposite angles are congruent. So the entire angle here on each opposite side is congruent. But we also know that the diagonals bisect the angles, which means all 4 of those little angles are the same size or congruent. So we can set 11x congruent or equal to 55. We divide both sides by 11, x equals 5. In the final example, they give you 2 sides. In a rhombus, we know that all sides are congruent, which means we can set any 2 sides equal to each other. So 10x minus 5 equals 7x plus 1. To solve, subtract 7x from each side to get your variables all on one side, leaving you with 3x minus 5 equals 1. Add 5 to each side, so your constants are on one side. 3x equals 6, and divide both sides by 3 to get your final answer, which is x equals 2. Our final shape is a square, and a square is a parallelogram with 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. So a square basically has everything that a parallelogram, a rectangle, and a rhombus has that are true. So our properties: opposite sides parallel, 2, all sides congruent, 3, 4 90-degree angles, 4 diagonals bisect each other, 5 diagonals are congruent, 6 diagonals bisect angles, and 7 diagonals are perpendicular. Again, pause the video and try these 3 examples using those properties. In our first example, we know that each of our angles is 90 degrees. We also know that the diagonal cuts each of those angles in half. So if I take 90 and divide it by 2, I know that that small piece x is 45. In example B, I know my diagonals are perpendicular, so each of those center angles is 90 degrees. I can set 10x equal to 90, divide both sides by 10, and my answer for x is 9. In the final example, I know that all 4 sides are congruent, so I can set any 2 sides equal to each other. 2x equals x plus 5. Subtract x from each side, and your answer for x is 5. The rest is extra practice to think about, so think through the problems, try them, and then watch the video for the answers. To help with this, we are going to draw out a diagram with all the shapes that we've learned. First, we started off by learning quadrilaterals. Then we got more specific and learned about parallelograms. two types of parallelograms are a rectangle and a rhombus. And if a shape is both a rectangle and a rhombus, it is a square. The first question says a rhombus is a square. A rhombus has to have four sides equal, but it might not also have the four angles equal. If it can happen, but doesn't always happen, it's sometimes. When you read the statement, if you go down from rhombus to square, that's sometimes. A square is a parallelogram. So when we read this statement, square is at the bottom and parallelogram is up higher. If you move higher, that tells you that's an always statement. It's impossible to have a square that's not a parallelogram. Number 3, a rectangle is a quadrilateral. That always happens. Every rectangle has four sides. When you read the statement, you move up. And a parallelogram has four right angles. That would be saying a parallelogram that's a rectangle. When you read that statement, you move down, so that is sometimes. We will see some never examples a little bit later. The last section, you're determining the most specific name. In number 1, you have four right angles, which means it's a rectangle. In number 2, you have four sides congruent, which means it's a rhombus. In number 3, you have opposite sides parallel and congruent. That's one of the ways we learn to prove parallelograms. And in number 4, you have diagonals bisecting each other, and since all four of those pieces are the same, the diagonals are also congruent. That's what we just learned about a rectangle. Using these properties, finish filling out your flashcards and bring your notes and flashcards to class on Friday.